The maid introduced in the heart of a busy city stood an old mansion, its tall windows and golden chandeliers shining like something out of a storybook. It was the kind of place where the rich came to laugh, drink, and forget the outside world. Every week, the grand hall filled with people in fine clothes, their shoes clicking against marble floors polished so bright they looked like mirrors. Among them, almost invisible, moved the maid. She was small in frame, dressed in a plain uniform that was always neat, but never noticed. While the guests carried diamonds on their wrists and pearls around their necks, she carried heavy trays stacked with glasses that caught the light, or plates steaming with food prepared by the unseen kitchen. No one ever asked where she came from. To the guests, she was part of the furniture, like the candle holders, like the velvet curtains, like the sound of shoes in the hall. She was there to serve, not to be seen. But if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed something unusual about her. Her eyes, quiet and steady, held a kind of depth, as though she carried whole stories that no one bothered to hear. Her day always started before dawn. Long before the mansion lit up with music and laughter, she was already awake, sweeping, polishing, setting tables that would later be covered with spilled wine and crumbs. She worked with practiced rhythm, her hands moving fast but careful. And though her body was tired, she never complained. To her, silence was safer than words. Yet, there was something about her silence that was not empty. It was the kind of silence that carried a secret, a silence that almost felt like it was waiting for something no one could name. When she carried trays between the rows of guests, she kept her eyes down. But sometimes in the reflection of the glass, you could see her lips move, almost as if she was humming to herself. No one noticed. The hall was too loud with laughter, with arguments about money and politics, with the clinking of glasses raised in endless toasts. Still, she had a world of her own. Late at night, after the parties ended and the lights dimmed, she would clean, alone in the empty hall. And there, when no one was watching, she sometimes sang to herself softly, quietly, in a voice that felt too big for her small frame. It wasn't the kind of singing taught in schools or polished for theaters. It was raw, simple, and true. It was the sound of longing, of hope, of memory. But that voice had never left the walls of the mansion. The marble had heard it. The empty tables had heard it, but the rich guests had not. To them, she was only the maid. On the night this story begins, the mansion was brighter than ever. A celebration was planned, bigger than usual, with guests arriving in long cars that lined the street outside. The hall glowed with golden light and laughter spilled from the wide doors. The maid moved quickly from one end of the room to the other, balancing trays with steady arms. Her footsteps soft as though she wanted the floor itself not to notice. She passed by groups of guests who barely saw her. One guest waved his hand impatiently for another drink. Another brushed past her without a glance, his eyes fixed on someone across the hall. The conversations rose and fell around her, the sound of wealth and power filling the air. To them, she was nobody. But here's the thing about people who are treated like nobody. Sometimes, they carry something inside that nobody expects. At that moment, no one in the hall knew what was coming. No one knew that before the night was over, the maid they ignored would make them forget to breathe. But for now, she was only moving quietly between them, her head bowed, her steps light. A shadow in the glow of chandeliers, soft figure in the middle of voices that spoke too loudly. And yet, if anyone had stopped to listen, not to the music, not to the laughter, but to the quiet hum under her breath, they might have felt a chill down their spine. They might have sensed that there was more to her than folded napkins and polished trays. The story of the maid begins here, in her silence. A silence full of hidden songs waiting for a moment that would change everything. The background and shadows before the maid became a quiet figure in a mansion full of rich laughter. She was a child of small roads and wide skies. Her story did not begin with marble floors or chandeliers. It began in a little village, far from the city, where dust rose with every step and nights were filled with the sound of crickets and the wind. Moving through the fields, her family had little. Their house was made of uneven wood, patched so many times it looked more like a puzzle than a home. When it rained, water dripped through the roof and filled small pots, placed carefully on the floor. Food was never enough, but somehow they managed to share what they had. In those small walls, hunger was common, but so was love. From an early age, she worked beside her parents. She carried water in clay jars that were almost bigger than her arms. She bent low in the fields, pulling weeds, her small hands blistered from rough soil. When she was too tired to stand, she sat under a tree, listening to her grandmother hum the songs of old times. Those songs were not just melodies, they were memories. Her grandmother sang about long journeys, about waiting for loved ones who never came back, about the beauty of stars above quiet nights. The little girl would sit close, pressing her ear to the old woman's chest, feeling the vibration of each note. That was her first music lesson, not from books, not from teachers, but from a voice that carried history. Life was not easy. Many days she watched her parents return home with tired faces, their backs bent from long work. Sometimes her father sat silent, staring at the ground as though counting invisible numbers. Sometimes her mother hid tears while stirring thin soup. But even in those shadows there were sparks of light. The girl learned to smile at small things. The sound of rain on the roof, the warmth of a shared blanket, the laughter of younger siblings chasing each other in the yard. What made her different was her voice. Even as a child, when she sang, people in the village turned their heads. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. It was the kind of voice that seemed to travel past the listener's ears and land straight in the heart. She didn't sing to impress. She sang because it helped her forget the hunger, the hard days, the heavy jars of water, but dreams are often heavy for the poor. Her family never had money for school uniforms or music lessons. When she asked once if she could learn to sing properly, her mother shook her head gently. "We cannot afford teachers," she said. "Your voice is yours. Keep it safe. Sing when you can." So she did. When she grew older, the city called. Work was scarce in the village, and families sent their children away in hopes of survival. She was only a teenager when she first left home, carrying a small bundle of clothes and her grandmother's scarf. Her mother pressed her hands tightly and whispered, "Remember your songs. They will keep you company when the world feels cold." City was nothing like the village. It was louder, harsher, filled with car horns and strangers who didn't look each other in the eye. For someone who had grown up with open skies, the tall buildings felt like walls. She found work as a maid, first in smaller homes, then later in the mansion where our story takes place. There she learned the art of silence. In the village, people greeted one another, shared food, shared songs. In the city, she discovered that silence was safer. Words could lead to trouble, to punishment, to dismissal. So she folded her songs deep inside her, like letters no one was meant to read. But inside, she carried her past. Every time she walked through the bright hall of the mansion, she remembered the muddy fields. Every time she polished silver, she remembered her grandmother's cracked hands teaching her how to knead bread. Every time she bent her head before wealthy guests, she remembered lifting her head to look at endless stars in her village sky. Her life was now shadows and work. But her voice was still there, waiting. She never forgot the scarf, folded in her small drawer. On nights when the hall was empty, she would hold it close, close her eyes, and sing softly. So soft that only the walls heard. The background of the Maid was not written in wealth or power. It was written in hunger, in work, in quiet love, and in the songs of an old woman who refused to let memories die. And that is why her silence was never empty. Behind her quiet steps in the mansion, behind the bowed head and plain uniform, there was a history no guest could imagine. History of fields, of cracked voices, of carrying too much too young. This was the shadow she came from. And it was this shadow that gave her song its weight, the weight that one day would bring a hall of rich guests to complete silence. The night of the gathering, the mansion had seen many grand evenings, but this night was different. Even before the doors opened, the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were waiting. Servants rushed from room to room, polishing glasses, laying down endless rows of silver forks and knives. Chandeliers were lit one by one, their golden light spilling across the floor until the marble shone like water. The maid moved quickly, but her steps were silent. She carried trays, refilled candles, and checked the tables. Her hands worked from memory, placing napkins just so, adjusting flowers so they bent in the right direction. She had done this routine countless times, but tonight felt larger, louder, almost alive. Outside, the city street filled with the hum of engines. Long cars pulled up one after another, each door opening to release guests dressed in glittering clothes. Men wore suits so fine the fabric barely wrinkled when they moved. Women stepped out draped in silk, with necklaces that seemed to sparkle even before the lights touched them. They spoke with easy laughter, their voices carrying before. They even entered the hall. When the doors finally opened, a river of wealth poured inside. Coats were taken, drinks were placed into waiting hands, and the hall filled with sound, the sharp clinking of glasses, the layered chatter of voices, the occasional burst of laughter that rose higher than the rest. The maid kept her head down as she moved between them, balancing trays heavy with drinks. To the guests, she was nothing more than part of the furniture, another pair of invisible hands to keep their glasses full. They never noticed the way she avoided collisions, or how she shifted her weight so smoothly that even when a guest brushed past her, not a single drop spilled, but she noticed everything. She noticed the way one man bragged too loudly about his business, the way another woman rolled her eyes when her friend turned away. She noticed the false smiles, the secret boredom behind bright jewelry, the constant hunger in their eyes not for food but for being seen, for being admired. The musicians played in one corner of the hall, their instruments filling the air with practiced notes. A violin sang, a piano followed, and the sound mixed with the laughter of the rich. But even music on nights like this was background noise. The guests were louder, they always were. Still, the maid worked quietly, her eyes lowered. She carried trays back and forth, moving almost like a shadow between bursts of color and sound. Her silence was her shield. Then something unexpected happened. The violinist snapped a string. It was a sharp, sudden sound, like a whip cutting through the air. For a moment, the music stuttered, then stopped. The other instruments tried to cover it, but it was too late. The hall, used to constant background music, grew uneasy. Conversations paused, heads turned. Even the laughter faltered. The maid froze for just a second, standing near the edge of the room with a tray in her hands. To her, it was only a broken string. But to the guests, used to perfection, it was a disruption. They shifted, restless, like children waiting for entertainment. One guest laughed and raised his glass. "Well, what now? Shall we sing for ourselves?" His voice carried, half mocking, half playful. Another voice joined louder. "Let the servants sing. Surely they know something simple." The maid lowered her eyes quickly, hoping the attention would pass, but servants often whispered about her. They had heard her voice in the kitchen, in the empty hallways, soft and unguarded. One of them, perhaps trying to be helpful, or perhaps mischievous, spoke up. "She can sing," the servant said, nodding toward the maid. Dozens of eyes turned. The maid felt her face flush. Her grip tightened on the tray, her knuckles white. Wanted to disappear into the walls, to slip back into the kitchen, to hide among pots and pans where no one looked at her. But the guests were curious now. Curious in the way people become when they expect a show at no cost to themselves. Their gazes pressed down on her, heavy, demanding. She shook her head faintly, trying to move, but a voice cut through. "Come on, girl, sing. Entertain us while we wait." A ripple of agreement spread across the hall. Some clapped lightly, others leaned forward, eager. It was not kindness, it was expectation. The same kind that always demanded more from those who had less. The maid's heart pounded. She had never stood before a crowd like this. Her songs belonged to shadows, 2 nights when only walls listened. Now, under the glare of chandeliers, with jeweled eyes fixed on her, she felt small, smaller than ever. And yet deep inside her chest something stirred, a memory. A voice that was not hers but her grandmother's. "Your voice is yours. Keep it safe. Sing when you can." She took a breath. The tray trembled in her hands, but she steadied it, placed it carefully on. a nearby table, and straightened her back. The hall quieted, sensing something. For the first time that night, the maid lifted her eyes. The chance unfolds the hall was still, but not silent. Glasses clinked faintly, shoes shifted against marble, a whisper here, a cough there. All of it wove together into a strange hush that was heavier than noise. Dozens of eyes rested on the maid she had spent years mastering invisibility, and now, in a single breath, it was gone. Her hands empty now, without the tray, felt awkward at her sides. Her throat was dry. She wanted to step back, to shake her head and melt into the kitchen doorway. Yet the circle of attention had closed around her, and escape no longer seemed possible. A woman in pearls leaned forward, smiling as though coaxing a child. "Go on," she said softly, though her tone carried the edge of command. "Just a little song. Something from wherever it is you come from." The words stung. The maid lowered her gaze, her chest tight, but the sound of her grandmother's voice returned as if carried on the air. "Your voice is yours. Keep it safe. Sing when you can," she inhaled. Her breath was shaky, but she held it for a moment, steadying herself. She thought of the fields she had walked as a child, nights under skies too wide for walls, the warmth of her grandmother's scarf pressed against her cheek. Slowly she lifted her chin. The hall leaned closer. Guests whispered to one another, exchanging curious glances. To them, this was novelty. A servant song something to laugh about later, perhaps, or to recall as an odd little story. They had no idea what was coming. The maid opened her mouth. For a heartbeat, no sound came. Then, like water from a hidden spring, the first note rose. It was soft, fragile, almost hesitant. A single thread of sound weaving into the air. For a moment, it seemed too small to hold the room. But then, something shifted. The note grew, steady and clear, carrying not just sound, but memory, feeling, life. The hall changed. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Glasses hovered half-raised. The musicians, their instruments still silent, turned to listen. Even the chandeliers seemed to glow differently. As though the song itself bent the light, she sang the old lullaby one her grandmother had hummed on nights when the wind shook the windows of their little wooden house. The words were simple, born of soil and sky, but her voice gave them wings. Each note carried the ache of hunger, the softness of love, the hope that had survived in the darkest corners of her life. The guests had expected amusement, maybe a clumsy little tune. Instead, they found themselves holding their breath. Her voice was not trained, but it was true. It slipped past their polished surfaces, past their jeweled collars, and found the places they kept hidden, the places where loneliness sat, where longing slept, where unspoken fears lived. It was not just a song, it was a mirror held up to their souls. As she sang, the maid forgot the hall. She forgot the eyes fixed on her, the chandeliers above, the restless shifting of guests in fine clothes. In her mind, she was back in the fields. Standing barefoot in the dirt, the night wind cool on her skin, she sang to the stars, to her grandmother's memory, to the little girl she had once been. The song grew stronger, richer. Her voice swelled until it filled the hall like a tide. The marble floor carried it, the golden walls echoed it, the chandeliers trembled with its weight. The guests, so used to noise and spectacle, could do nothing but listen. Some felt their eyes sting unexpectedly. Others felt their chests tighten. They had heard singers before, trained voices, operas, grand performances. But this was different. This was raw truth wrapped in sound, and the maid, small and visible, nameless, stood at the center of it all, transformed. She no longer looked like a servant. She no longer looked like someone meant to blend into the background. For those few minutes, she was light itself. When her song reached its final line, she let the note linger, long and trembling, until it finally dissolved into silence. The silence was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. For the first time that evening, wealth had no power. Titles meant nothing. And the rich were humbled by something they could not buy. The maid lowered her head again, suddenly aware of where she was, of who she was supposed to be. Heat rushed to her face. She wanted to step back, to reclaim her invisibility, to disappear before the silence broke. But the silence did not break. It stretched on, heavier and heavier, until it felt like the air itself was waiting. And in that stillness, one truth became clear. The maid's voice had changed the room forever. The first note becomes a storm. The final note drifted into the air like smoke, thin and weightless, and then it was gone. For a moment, nothing replaced it. The hall stood in silence so sharp it felt alive. Guests sat with glasses half raised, forks frozen above untouched plates, breaths caught in their throats. The maid lowered her eyes again, her chest rising and falling with the effort of the song. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. For a second, she wondered if she had made a mistake, if she had broken some unspoken rule by daring to let her voice rise where only laughter and wealth were meant to echo. But no one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the hall itself had forgotten how to breathe. Then, slowly, the silence shifted. A man near the front blinked, his mouth parting as though to say something, but no words came. A woman who had earlier demanded entertainment now pressed, her hand lightly against her chest, her pearls trembling with the small movement. Another guest, one known for his loud laughter, lowered his glass with unsteady fingers. The storm began not with noise, but with stillness, the kind that rattles more than thunder. The maid, sensing the weight of their eyes, stepped back slightly. She wanted to retreat, to slip into the safety of shadow, but her feet refused to move. She was caught between fear and something else, something she couldn't name. It was the guests who broke first. A sound rose from the far corner. It wasn't applause, not yet. It was a breath, a sharp, shaky inhale, as though someone had just woken from a dream. Then another and another, until the whole hall seemed to sigh at once. A chorus of lungs remembering their duty. And then came the clapping. It started slow, hesitant, as if the guests were unsure whether it was allowed. But once the first hands came together, others followed, and soon the sound swelled into thunder. Palms striking palms, voices rising, chairs scraping. Against the marble as people stood, the maid flinched at the sound, unused to such force directed at her. For a heartbeat she thought it might be anger. But then she lifted her head slightly, and what she saw was not fury. It was astonishment. The guests were applauding her. Some clapped with wide smiles, others with wet eyes. A few whispered to their neighbors, shaking their heads in disbelief. And still, the applause grew, rolling through the hall like waves crashing against stone. The musicians, who had gone silent after the broken string, looked at her with open admiration. One of them even set his instrument down entirely, as if conceding that nothing he could play would match what they had just heard. For the maid, the noise was overwhelming. She had sung her whole life, but never to be celebrated, never to be seen. To her, singing was survival, a way to carry sorrow, a way to remember love. It was never meant to fill gilded rooms, and yet here she was, standing in the center of a storm made from clapping hands and astonished voices. A woman stepped closer, her jewels flashing in the chandelier's glow. "Where did you learn to sing like that?" she asked breathlessly, her tone more curious than kind. The maid lowered her gaze, unsure how to answer. She wanted to say in the fields, beside my grandmother. She wanted to say in the dark, when no one was listening, but words failed her, and she stayed silent. The guests filled the silence with their own guesses. She must have been trained in secret. No, surely, some natural talent, imagine. A voice like that hiding in a maid's dress. Their laughter returned, but it was different now, less careless, more charged. They laughed not at her, but in awe of her. The sound made her uneasy. Praise could be as heavy as scorn. Still, she could not deny what had just happened. For the first time since stepping into the mansion, she was not invisible. The applause lingered long after her voice had faded. Some guests even asked for more, clapping and calling out for another song. The musicians exchanged glances, uncertain whether to resume their work or bow to the new star of the evening. The maid, trembling, gave a small shake of her head. She had offered one song, and it had cost her all the courage she had gathered. To sing again now, in this storm of attention, felt impossible. But even her refusal only seemed to deepen their fascination. "She's modest," someone whispered. "She doesn't even know her worth," another replied. The words washed over her, too loud, too sharp. She longed for the quiet of the kitchen, the safety of sweeping floors when no one was watching, and yet beneath her fear a spark glowed. Oh, she had been seen. She had been heard. The storm of applause eventually softened, though the room never fully returned to its former rhythm. Laughter resumed, glasses clinked again, but every so often a pair of eyes drifted back to the maid, as if to confirm she was real and not imagined. The maid returned to her work, lifting a tray once more, moving quietly among them. But nothing was the same. Not for her, and not for them. For she had sung, and in that song, the rich had forgotten to breathe. The breathless silence deepens, the storm of applause had ended, but silence returned, not the ordinary silence of a hall between songs, but one thick with thought. The guests tried to return to their conversations, yet their words came slower now, their laughter softer. As if the song had taken something from them they could not easily replace. The maid, with her tray in hand once again, moved quietly among them. Her head was lowered, her step steady, but her heart still beat too fast. She wanted nothing more than to vanish back into the kitchen, to hide behind the comfort of tasks that required no eyes on her. But the guests kept watching. Not openly, not rudely, just with glances that followed her like shadows. For many, the song had cracked something inside. One man, who had earlier been boasting loudly about his business, now sat quiet, his drink untouched. The melody reminded him of a field from his childhood, before money and ambition carried him away. He could almost smell the earth again, could almost hear his mother's voice humming as she worked. He blinked quickly, brushing at his eye, and when another guest asked if he was all right, he only nodded and turned away. A woman in jewels sat with her chin resting on her hand. She had listened with her body still, her face unreadable, but inside, the song had unearthed a memory she had long buried. Years ago, she had dreamed of singing herself, before her marriage had placed her into a world where appearances mattered more than passions. Now, hearing the maid's voice, she felt both envy and longing, as though the song had stolen breath from her, twice, once for its beauty, and once for what it reminded her she had lost. Even the servants felt it. They had always known the maid's voice in whispers, caught in passing as she worked alone. But never like this, seeing her stand before the guests, hearing her fill the grand hall with sound. They felt pride swelling quietly in their chests. She was one of them, someone unseen, someone overlooked hand yet for a few minutes. She had made the rich stop and listen. The musicians, too, sat in silence longer than expected. They had trained for years, mastered their instruments, polished their skills until their fingers could play without thought, and yet the maid's song had reminded them of something purer. It was not skill alone that had moved the hall, but truth. They exchanged looks, some humbled, some uneasy. The chandeliers above glittered as always. But even the light seemed different now, warmer, quieter, almost respectful of what had happened. The hall that had always belonged to wealth and laughter now held something else, a memory that could not be erased. The maid felt the weight of it all. Each glance pressed against her skin, each whisper felt sharper than usual. She tried to keep her focus on her work, refilling glasses, clearing plates, but her mind was still wrapped in the song. She hadn't planned to sing. She hadn't wanted to. When the moment came, she had given a part of herself she had always kept hidden, and now it was no longer hers alone. The silence that followed her everywhere was not the safe silence she was used to. It was not the silence of being ignored. It was the silence of being remembered. As she passed a table, a man stopped her. His voice was low, careful. "That song? Where did you learn it?" She froze for half a heartbeat, then gave a small shake of her head. "It is just an old song," she whispered, almost too quiet to hear. The man nodded, but his eyes stayed on her as she walked away. Another guest leaned to her friend. "Imagine that," she said softly. "A voice like that, hidden all this time," her friend replied. It makes you wonder what else we've failed to see. That thought, though small, hung in the air, heavier than their laughter. The night continued. Plates were served, more wine was poured, conversations resumed. Blow! But beneath every sound ran a quiet undercurrent. A shared awareness that the maid had given them something they could not fully understand. Some guests tried to bury the feeling quickly, laughing louder than before, drowning it with food and drink. But others carried it in silence, their thoughts restless. They had come for entertainment, for luxury, for another night like so many before. Instead, they had been reminded by a single voice that beauty could live in the most unexpected places. That truth did not wear jewels or silk, and that sometimes the invisible carried the greatest weight of all. And so, even as the banquet carried on, the hall remained different. Every word spoken, every laugh, every toast, carried a shadow of that song, silence beneath the sound. The maid felt it too. She moved quietly, just as she always had, but she knew things had changed, no matter how much she lowered her head. No matter how softly she stepped, she could not be invisible again. And though it frightened her, a small part of her deep inside felt stronger for it, because now the silence in the hall no longer belonged to wealth. It belonged to her voice. The last note falls. The song had ended long ago, yet it lingered in the air like perfume that refused to fade. The banquet continued, and form music resumed, waiters moved, glasses clinked, but beneath it all was the memory of that final note. It hung over the hall like an invisible chandelier, heavier than gold, brighter than crystal. The maid felt it. With every step she took, she carried trays again, as if nothing had happened, yet her hands shook slightly when she set down a glass. She tried to fold herself back into silence, into invisibility, but it was impossible now. The guests had seen her. Worse, they had felt her. And feelings are not easily forgotten. One guest whispered to another, still staring at her, "How can someone like her?" His words trailed off, unfinished, because there was no neat way to complete the thought. Another, with silver hair and rings stacked high on his fingers, leaned back in his chair. He was not a man easily impressed, but his face had softened in a way that unsettled him. He sipped his drink slowly, though he tasted nothing. The melody ran through his mind, haunting him, refusing to be drowned by wine. The maid passed his table, her eyes lowered, but he found himself wanting to speak, to thank her. The words rose to his lips, but he swallowed them. Compliments were cheap here, and her song had not been. At another table, a young guest fiddled with her necklace. She was the one who had first demanded that a servant sing. Now she shifted uncomfortably. Replaying the moment in her mind, she had expected clumsy notes, something to laugh at, a way to pass time. Instead, she had been given truth so sharp it cut her. She avoided the maid's eyes, ashamed. Even the musicians, who had resumed their playing, faltered now and then. Their fingers hit the right keys, their bows slid across strings, but their hearts were elsewhere. They had performed countless times, before wealthy crowds, but never had they seen silence so complete, applause so desperate, or eyes so wide. They knew in some quiet part of themselves that tonight's performance did not belong to them, belonged to the maid and the maid. Herself, she stood in the storm of all these unspoken thoughts, trying to remain steady. She told herself it was over, that she had sung, that it was done, that she could fade again. But inside, she knew differently. A part of her had shifted. She had sung in a place where she was never meant to, and instead of rejection, she had been met with awe. That truth frightened her, and it warmed her. The last note of her song, long vanished, was still alive in memory. She felt it every time someone's eyes followed her across the room. She felt it when whispers hushed as she passed. That single note had left her body, but it had not left the hall. It lived on, replaying silently in the minds of every guest. Who had heard it? And perhaps that was the greatest power of all, that a moment so brief could echo endlessly. As the night deepened, the hall seemed different. Laughter came more cautiously, as though everyone was aware that they were standing inside a memory being written. The chandeliers still sparkled, the glasses still chimed. But underneath it all pulsed something quieter, heavier. The maid returned to the kitchen for a moment to steady herself. She leaned against the cool wall, closing her eyes, pressing her hands together as though holding her own heart in place. She thought of her grandmother, again the woman who had taught her songs beneath starry skies. If only she could have seen this. If only she could have known that her lullabies would one day still the breath of the wealthy. But then the maid shook her head. No, her grandmother would not have cared about chandeliers or jeweled collars. She would have cared only that her granddaughter's voice had carried truth. That was enough. When the maid returned to the hall, something subtle happened. Guests stepped aside for her, did not order her about as before. They did not wave her down with impatient hands. Instead, they watched quietly, their commands softened, their tones gentler. It was not respect, not yet. But it was different. She remained silent. But inside, she felt the shift. She had not just sung a song. She had cracked the polished surface of their world and shown them something raw underneath that could not be undone. As the night drew on, the weight of her song only grew. It was as though every passing minute pressed the memory deeper. Into the walls, into the guests, into the maid herself. The final note had fallen, yes, but it had not disappeared. It had planted itself in them, in ways they would not fully understand until long after they left the hall. And in that, the maid's voice had done something extraordinary. It had turned silence into memory, and memory into power. Reflection and legacy. The banquet ended as all banquets eventually do. The golden light dimmed, the tables cleared, and the long cars outside returned one by one to carry the guests away. Laughter and conversation spilled into the night, but quieter than before, as if the weight of the song still pressed against their throats. The maid, as always, stayed behind. She collected glasses, gathered plates, folded napkins, stained with wine. To any outsider looking in, she appeared the same as she always had, silent, moving through her tasks like clockwork. Yet inside, she knew she would never again be the same, for the first time. She had not just served the hall, she had stilled it as she worked. Fragments of her song replayed in her mind. She did not sing again that night. She was too tired, too overwhelmed. But the memory of the final note lived in her chest, as though a part of it had never left her body. She wondered if this was how her grandmother had felt when singing to the fields, a sense that the song did not just belong to her, but to the world that listened, and though the rich had returned to their jeweled homes, they carried something. 2.1 Man, alone in his carriage, leaned back against the seat. The city lights blurred past his window, but his mind was not in the present. It was years earlier, when he had been a boy running barefoot across a dusty yard, hearing his mother, as she cooked. He had spent decades burying that memory under wealth and pride. But tonight, the maid's song had dug it out like a root pulled from the earth. He pressed his lips together, unsettled. He would tell no one about this moment, but it would follow. Him, a woman, adjusting her silk shawl, sat quietly as her driver asked where she wished to go. For the first time in years, she hesitated. Normally, she would give the name of another glittering hall, another party. But tonight, she asked to be taken home. Alone in her room, she removed her necklace, set it aside, and whispered the faintest line of the maid's lullaby to herself. Her voice cracked, but her heart swelled. She had not sung in years. Others carried the memory differently. Some avoided thinking about it, burying themselves in chatter, in business, in routine. But even in avoidance, the song stayed like a shadow, like a ghost, waiting for quiet moments to return. Back in the mansion, the other servants whispered in the kitchen. They had seen one of their own step out of invisibility and capture the attention of the powerful. They felt pride, but also a kind of trembling hope. If the maid could be heard even once, then perhaps they too carried something inside worth more than their uniforms and duties. The musicians packed away their instruments with unusual silence. They had played too many wealthy crowds, yet none of those nights would be remembered as this one would. One violinist, his broken string still dangling, thought to himself that he had not truly played music in years. He had only performed. The maid had reminded him of the difference, and so the legacy of her song spread quietly.
Not in headlines.
Not in announcements, but in hearts. The maid herself did not seek fame. The next morning she woke, as always, before the sun, to sweep and polish. But when she looked into the hall, now empty, she saw it differently. She imagined her voice still there, clinging to the corners, woven into the walls, impossible to erase. For the first time, she felt the hall belonged to her as much as it belonged to them. Days would pass, and the guests would tell the story. Some would exaggerate it, saying the maid sang like an angel. Others would soften it, embarrassed to admit how deeply it had touched them. But all of them, no matter their words, would remember the silence that followed her final note. That silence was her gift. It had shown them that wealth could not shield them from truth. That beauty did not need gold to shine, and that even the smallest, quietest person could carry a power no chandelier could match. For the maid, the legacy was simpler. She carried on, still working, still moving unseen, but inside, she no longer believed she was invisible. She had been heard once. She knew now she could be heard again if she chose. And so, though the night ended, though the banquet faded into memory, the story of her song lived on. It lived in the rich who had forgotten to breathe. It lived in the servants who whispered with pride. It lived in the musicians who felt humbled, and in the chandeliers that seemed to glow a little differently ever since. Most of all, it lived in her, because once a voice has broken silence, it can never truly return to being hidden. And so, the maid's legacy was not the applause, not the admiration, not even the whispers afterward. Her legacy was the silence she created, the silence that reminded everyone present of what they had forgotten, that truth can rise from anywhere.